What do you think?
Ben, we're gonna need an assist here.
Yeah, and big rock, make little rocks.
No problem. Step aside, Sparky.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So yeah, those of you who have been following the channel recently will know the deal by now. For anybody who's new, we've been looking at a whole bunch of 6th generation titles, many of which I've been playing for the first time ever. Since several of my recent reviews have been from movie tie-ins, I figured I would continue the trend. Today I'm going to be doing something I've never done before on the channel. I'm going to review 2 games at the same time, both of which again being movie tie-ins. As you can tell by the title, these tie-ins are for the Fantastic Four movie duology. Initially I was going to review both games individually, but I figured for the sake of convenience, I might as well just cover them both in the same video. Particularly since both games are relatively similar in a lot of ways, and you can tell that they pretty much followed the same formula, as well as being developed by the same team. So starting with the first game, simply named Fantastic Four, released in 2005, developed by 7 Studios. So the game is of course based on the Fantastic Four movie of the same year, which despite being torn apart by critics, I happen to really like personally. In my opinion it's a bit underrated, and way better than any modern Marvel movie. That's not to say that it didn't have its problems, but I think the movie was well acted for the most part, had some pretty good special effects and some decent comedy. And unlike most superhero films, it had a plot that actually made sense. As I've talked about on the channel many times before, during this era pretty much every major release had its own tie-in game released alongside it, and Fantastic Four was no different. As I've talked about on the channel many times before, these games had a very negative reputation, and were more often than not considered cash grabs, made to simply capitalise on the movie's popularity. However, again, as I've discussed many times before, every now and then a movie tie-in would come along that bucked the trend, and turned out to be significantly better than expected.
Trust me, this ain't one of them times.
So was Fantastic Four one of those games? Let's talk about it. So the game is a third-person action-adventure beat-em-up. As far as the overall story goes, it's based very loosely on the events of the movie. However, in true movie license game fashion, it uses the movie's plot as a template, and fills in the game's runtime with a whole bunch of extra concepts, many of which come straight from the wider Marvel Comics universe. Just like the movie, the game begins with a team of scientists based aboard the Von Doom space station, coming under attack from a blast of cosmic radiation, turning them into the superhero team, the Fantastic Four. Before I go any further, I would appreciate it if you guys would hit the like button, since it really helps the channel, and feel free to subscribe for more videos just like this one. Let's get started with the review. You start the game off as Ben Grimm, where you get a useful tutorial that helps to familiarise you with the game's controls. Once the tutorial ends, the station gets hit by the blast. The game covers most of the plot points from the movie, with plenty of cutscenes to convey the story. In between these moments there are also several new developments, added for the sake of content. The team will come across several other villains from the comics, who didn't make an appearance in the movie, as well as a whole bunch of new enemies to contend with. As far as the overall gameplay goes, as I mentioned before, the game is essentially a beat-em-up. Similar in many ways to games such as the X-Men Legends series, which as long-time subscribers of mine will know I reviewed on the channel a while back, link in description. The reason I bring up X-Men Legends specifically, because it's very possible that this game was inspired by many aspects of it, though sadly this game is a lot less refined, but I'll get to that later. Once the initial introduction is over, the game gives you an individual level with each of the game's characters, with a short separate tutorial familiarising you with them. This actually made me quite excited, since the early part of the game implies that each character will have their own unique gameplay style. For example, Reed's levels will have you hacking computers and solving basic puzzles, though the hacking minigame is very boring and I kinda wish the game didn't have it, but I digress. Sue's levels appear to be stealth oriented, with you using her invisibility to sneak past enemies, and even creep up on them to take them out silently. Something that long-time subscribers of mine will know I excel at in games. It gave me the impression that the game was going to be relatively varied. Unfortunately though, this is a bit of an illusion, since after you get introduced to each character, the game basically abandons this concept for the most part, and the vast majority of levels become purely combat based, and follow the exact same formula no matter what character you're forced to play as. The overall formula of the game is relatively simple. You basically enter an area, and are tasked with wiping out every enemy in the vicinity. Occasionally you'll have some light platforming sections, as well as some basic puzzle solving here and there. At the beginning of each level you'll take control of one or more of the Fantastic Four. Most levels will have you playing as just one of them, however occasionally you'll have a team of two. Very rarely will you have all four. This usually only occurs during boss battles, or major story moments. Some levels will be purely combat based, others will task you with rescuing civilians, escorting them and protecting them from harm. The reason this disappointed me is because, as I mentioned before, the early part of the game establishes that each character has different abilities, and the game, to its credit, does give them their own unique obstacles to interact with. But as far as the overall level design and formula goes, you basically do the exact same thing in every level with all of them. And I'd say about 90% of this game just has you beating up enemies over and over again, and the game starts to feel like a bit of a button masher. As far as the overall combat goes, it's relatively simple. You can strike enemies with both light and heavy attacks, and can mix these up in combination. In addition to this, each character has their own superpower that can be activated by holding down the trigger. These powers are purely combat related. You have a power bar that will need to be charged up to allow you to use these, which runs out very quickly. As you defeat enemies and complete objectives, you will unlock experience points. These points can be used to unlock new combo moves as well as new superpowers. These can also be upgraded to make them more effective. This of course does its bit to add some variety to the game. Each character will have their own uses in some regards. For example, Ben has super strength, and can lift objects the others can't. He also has the most powerful melee attacks, and can perform finishers on large enemies. Johnny can fly and has powerful long-ranged attacks. He also has several interactive obstacles where you will have to perform a quick-time event. As I mentioned before, Sue can turn invisible, and there are certain stealth sections where you will need to use this to progress, as well as to sneak up on enemies. She can also create shields to protect her allies and allow them to enter new areas. As for Reed, he can use his powers to access areas others can't, for example stretching through bars or reaching. As I mentioned before, he can also hack computers and solve puzzles. He can even make himself into a bridge to allow allies to cross. These aspects of the game do their bit to add some variety, but unfortunately they do repeat a bit too often for my liking, and they're nothing special. The game does have quite a bit of variety in terms of enemies as well as level and locations. For example, you have levels that take place in the sewers, the streets of New York where you take on various gangs, a museum where you fight mummies and even dinosaurs. You travel to Africa to take on tribal enemies. You even visit the Shield prison at one point and have to deal with a prison riot, recapturing prisoners and locking them up. You get a level where you have to return to the Von Doom space station and take on creepy, giant mutated plants. You'll occasionally come across shielded enemies, and enemies that will require specific strategies to defeat, such as needing to be attacked from behind. It's wise to figure out which superpowers work best against each enemy type, and be conservative with how you use them. In addition to these levels, you have levels that are basically recreations of the scenes from the movie. There are also quite a few collectibles to find in the game. For example, if you're willing to explore the levels a bit, then you can find extra lives that are useful for obvious reasons. and even superpower tokens which allow you to use special powers that temporarily make your attacks considerably more effective. These are few and far between, but can be fun to use. In addition to these collectibles, you also have Fantastic Four tokens that can unlock certain bonus features. More on those later. Every now and then you will get a section that introduces something new. For example, you get a turret section, a section where you control a giant mech, and several others. I mentioned before how the developers decided to add several villains from the Fantastic Four comics that didn't make an appearance in the movie. You come across the likes of Mole Man, the Puppet Master, Diablo, Blastar, Annihilus, Dragon Man, and several others. This of course includes Doctor Doom, who was the main villain of the movie. Several of these you get boss battles against. Speaking of boss battles, each act of the game usually ends with one, and these are typically the only levels that allow you to take control of all 4 characters at once, as I mentioned before. In addition to taking on these villains, you also take on some larger bosses, such as Mole Man's pet, as well as several large robotic enemies. A giant statue in the museum and a huge mummy. A giant energy worm. You even take on a giant plant boss at one point. The game of course culminates in a showdown against Doctor Doom. You get several boss battles against him towards the end of the game. Unfortunately, as great as all this sounds, if truth be told, it's all a bit of a chore to play for several reasons. And I personally wasn't a big fan of this game. One of the main issues I had with the game, and something that I've neglected to mention thus far, is the overall technicalities of it. This game, and let me be as blunt as I possibly can here, is flat out broken. First of all, the AI. I am not exaggerating when I say that this game has some of the absolute worst AI I think I have ever experienced in a game. Enemies would constantly bug out and start running into walls. Your allies are worse than useless in combat. And there were several moments in the game where it appeared that enemies and NPCs were left almost completely unprogrammed. In addition to the poor AI, the game has several clipping and collision detection problems, as well as some absolutely atrocious frame rate issues. Anytime there were more than a few enemies on screen at once, the frame rate dropped significantly, and it became a bit of an eyesore. This is made even worse during boss battles, where the game zooms out to allow the large boss, as well as all enemies to appear on screen at once, and it slows the game down drastically. The moments of the game that were supposed to be cool and badass just ended up being an eyesore. Another technical issue I noticed is that characters would often clip through walls and end up in areas they weren't supposed to access, leading to some of the characters being trapped. For example, in this level, Ben got trapped outside the room, meaning the other 3 had to deal with the boss themselves. That was quite weird. This, in addition to the repetitive combat in most of the levels, in my personal opinion just makes the game a chore to play. And it honestly doesn't have much to offer that you couldn't get from most action-adventure beat-em-ups of its kind. I mentioned before that the game has some bonus features, and to its credit, some of these are quite interesting. And I did enjoy checking them out. For example, in addition to the main campaign, the game also has an arena mode, where you can take the team to a chosen venue, most of which can be unlocked during the story mode, and defeat waves of enemies of your choice. Here you get a bit of a survival horde mode of sorts, which can be quite fun if you do like the game's combat. In addition to this, the game has a whole bunch of concept art to unlock, as well as comics that can be viewed and read from the menu. In addition to these, you can also unlock a whole bunch of interviews to watch and listen to, including interviews with some of the developers, and even some of the people behind the movie. In addition to these interviews, you also get interviews with the main voice cast. Adding some authenticity to the game, the lead actors from the movie decided to reprise their roles here, and each of them gives an in-depth interview talking about both the movie and the game itself, and they all had interesting things to say, and I enjoyed watching these. Michael Chiklis, who played Ben, in particular had a lot to say about the game, and appeared to have a blast with it.
Look at me! Don't tell me to calm down!
Good read.
It's clobbering time! It's clobbering time. That's funny.
In addition to all these interviews, the game also has a whole bunch of interviews with Stan Lee, who makes it very clear that he has a huge passion for Fantastic Four, and sees them as some of his best work.
In fact, at that time, I really wanted to quit, because I had been doing these comics for about 20 years, and I had the same instructions from my publisher all the time. And I don't know, I don't know how I came up with the idea, but I'm so glad I did, because I love the thing. I think he's one of the best characters I ever came up with.
Again, I enjoyed watching and listening to these. Some of these features are unlocked by finding the Fantastic Four tokens, others can simply be bought from the pause menu, using experience points gained during levels. It gives you an incentive to replay levels to save them up. Features like these are always appreciated by me.
Inside us all there lives a darkness, a sense of betrayal, a need for revenge.
The game also has some hidden bonus levels that can be unlocked if you're willing to grind. So yeah, that pretty much sums up what the game has to offer. It's a varied yet relatively generic action-adventure beat-em-up, and it's fun for a while. But unfortunately the repetitive gameplay, as well as absolutely horrendous technical issues, completely ruin the experience. It's a game that genuinely feels unfinished and unpolished, even when compared to most movie license games. And it's clearly an example of an unfinished product, making it one in a long list of disappointing movie tie-ins, and one that, despite the interesting bonus features, and a few decent ideas here and there, I wouldn't personally recommend. I give Fantastic Four a disappointing 3 out of 10. Not the worst game ever, but massively disappointing.
It's basic, really. 4 is greater than 1.
So with the first game being a disappointing, generic movie tie-in that failed to buck the trend in any way, there weren't many high hopes for 7 studios to deliver a good product in the sequel, and I can't imagine there was much demand for it back in the day. Nonetheless, the sequel did come out, as you already know if you're watching this, and 7 studios got a chance back in 2007 to make another one, with Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, once again released to tie in with the movie. As far as that movie goes, I personally have some mixed feelings on it. It has a lot more action and a lot more impressive special effects than the first movie, but unfortunately the movie's overall plot and writing was a bit disappointing in my opinion, and it wasn't quite as funny or as well acted as the first movie. I personally prefer the first movie a little bit, but I do like both to an extent. I think they're both a bit underrated, but I digress. Sadly, just like the first one, it got tore apart critically, and unlike the first one, this one failed to make enough money to justify a sequel, and it pretty much killed the franchise for a while. Only for another reboot to come out in 2015 to put the final nail in the coffin. On a side note, that movie is one of the worst I have ever seen, and one of the few examples of a time I actually agreed with the critics, but I digress. As far as the game goes, just like the first, it's based very loosely on the events of the movie, and it once again attempts to spice up the movie's plot by introducing new villains from the Marvel Comics who didn't make an appearance in the movie. The game is once again a third-person action-adventure beat-em-up that follows a very similar formula to the first game. It's worth pointing out that this game came out in the 7th generation of consoles, meaning that it's a HD game, and the production values have increased significantly since the first game. What you'll notice right off the bat is this game looks significantly better than the first. As I mentioned before, the first game's flat out ugly, really low res textures and character models, as well as some horrendous technical issues that flat out ruined the experience. This game, to its credit, appears to run very smoothly, and if nothing else it certainly looks a lot better. Not only in terms of graphical fidelity, but also in regards to its overall art style. I actually think the game looks great for a 2007 movie license game. Unfortunately though, that's about it in regards to improvements from the first, because sadly, despite the technical and visual improvements, the game has some of the same gameplay issues from the first game, and in some cases here they're even worse, believe it or not. So yeah, just like the movie, the game begins with several strange weather anomalies happening all over the world, with the US military enlisting the help of the Fantastic Four to help discover the cause of them. Unlike the movie, however, the game, as I mentioned before, makes an attempt to tie the plot in with several other characters from the Marvel Universe. You start the game off in a hidden underground cavern, where the team infiltrate a Skrull hideout.
Okay, walk me through this again, Reed. How does what's going on underground have anything to do with all that craziness up there?
Yeah, I got the same question as Hothead here.
All of my readings correlate exactly to this location. I've tracked a large cosmic energy spike to these coordinates. Find the source and maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to figure out why Earth is experiencing such strange weather anomalies.
Here you get a useful tutorial where you're introduced to the game's overall controls and combat. What I like about this game is that in the vast majority of levels, you actually get to control the entire team at once. There are a handful of levels where you're forced to play as just one, but we'll get to that later. For the most part, you get the whole team at once, and thankfully, the game can have all of them on screen with a lot of enemies without the frame rate dropping significantly, so that's a start. The game's overall formula is simple. Just like the first game, you enter a linear level and wipe out waves and waves of generic enemies. And once again, there's a decent amount of enemy variety. As I mentioned before, you take on several villain types from the Marvel comics. For example, you take on the Skrull, who are an alien race, as well as their leader, Super Skrull, who is kind of an amalgamation of all the Fantastic Four, using all their powers at once. You also take on Galactus's minions, as they attempt to clear the way for his arrival, I guess. You travel to a space station and take on Red Ghost and his army of space monkeys. I'm not joking, you actually do that in this game, and it seems to come out of nowhere. There's also a level where you take on a bunch of rock monsters in the mountains, before confronting their leader Terrax. Funnily enough, all this seems to come out of nowhere, and the story constantly introduces these new enemies and locations without giving them much context. I don't really mind this since it's a movie license game, and I don't necessarily expect top tier writing, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Speaking of writing, the dialogue in this game can be pretty funny at times, and I do like the banter back and forth between the team. It helps to keep me interested in the game's story. I suppose something has to, but I digress.
Anytime now, Mr. Fantastic.
I'm doing it. A few less distractions would help.
I'm good at batting away pests, Reed. Just say the word.
Once again, you activate each character's superpowers by holding down the right trigger, and choosing which power you want to use. The powers are pretty much exactly the same as the ones in the first game, but they do look and feel a lot better here. What I like about this too is you can actually combine powers by holding down the left trigger and selecting a nearby teammate to interact with. These help to make your attacks significantly more powerful and effective in combat. One annoying addition to combat is the ragdoll physics. Basically, this is one of them games where you get constantly knocked down by enemy attacks. And as far as I'm aware, there's no way to avoid this. I mean, I'd be playing as Ben, who is practically the ultimate tank character, and I'd be getting ragdolled by basic enemies like I was getting hit by Galactus. Very annoying. It actually made the game a bit disorienting here and there. It's something I hate when games do it. It's one of the issues I have with the modern GTA games, something I've talked about on the channel before, just an annoying feature that a lot of 7th generation games had, but I digress. Once again, each character has their own unique abilities, as well as curiosities to interact with. For example, Ben once again has super strength and can pick up large objects and throw them at enemies. In fact, in most levels I found myself defeating most enemies by simply throwing them off ledges as Ben. Sue can once again turn invisible, and once again this can be used in stealth sections. You can sneak up on enemies, and even hide from security cameras, and infiltrate areas silently that the others can't. Johnny can fly, and also activate certain machines. Reed can use his stretching abilities to reach certain switches that the others can't. Thankfully they took away those boring computer hacking puzzles for Reed from the first game. Speaking of puzzles, the game also has several puzzle solving sections here and there. For example, there's one level where you get a series of light reflecting puzzles. These remind me of the ones in the Haunted Mansion game, as well as the ones in Prisoner of Azkaban. They're actually quite challenging here. If truth be told, they actually felt like padding to me, since this game is incredibly short, more on that later. I mentioned before how you will occasionally be forced to play as one character. There are a few levels where you play as Johnny, and these are basically on-rail shooter sections, like the one where you chase the Silver Surfer like in the movie. I actually had a lot of fun with these despite how easy and simplistic they are. There's one level where you play as Sue, and I personally hated that level, but I digress. Aside from these rare examples, you usually have the full team to choose from. Just like the first game, you have a pretty simple level up system. Once again, you gain experience points by defeating enemies and completing levels, and these points can be used to purchase various upgrades for each character. Unfortunately, that pretty much sums up the positives for this game, because aside from all that, this game makes practically no improvements from the first. The main issue with the game for me is the level design. It's just boring. The first game, to its credit, had plenty of level and location variety. This game, on the other hand, has about 5 acts, and each of them is filled with boring, generic, copy and paste locations. I'm not exaggerating when I say this, there are whole sections of this game that are just flat out copied and pasted from each other, with little to no variation at all. This seems to get worse the longer the game goes on. One level in particular late in the game, simply known as Military Base, made me want to rage quit. It reminded me of that Durz's Fortress level from the Aragon game, remember that? Just the same boring, grey locations over and over again, and it's just lame. Also, the game constantly forces you to backtrack at times, enter an area, wipe out the enemies, then a door magically opens, go in and flip a switch, then go back, defeat the same enemies again. An invisible wall will magically disappear, rinse and repeat. Such a boring, generic and lazy level design that made the entire game a chore to play. It made it seem much longer and harder than it actually is. Speaking of length, this game is about 4 hours long, absolutely shocking game length. And a large chunk of it is just cutscenes. Yeah, there's actually a lot of cutscenes in this game, and to their credit these do look pretty good, and the character models are nice, at least compared to the ones in the first game. The game also has some boss battles, and let me be as blunt as I possibly can here, these are some of the worst designed boss battles I have ever experienced in my life. So basically this is one of them games where the developers seem to think that rather than actually fighting the boss, the player would rather spend most of the battle taking on swarms of the boss's minions. You know, the same enemies you've been fighting the entire level up until that point, and occasionally getting a few shots in on the boss when the game decides to let you. You take on the likes of Super Skrull, Terrax, several mini-bosses such as giant robot enemies, and you also get a final battle against Doctor Doom like in the first game. Though it's a lot worse here. He's significantly more powerful here due to taking control of the Silver Surfer's board. You might be wondering about Galactus, since he was technically the main threat of the movie, and it culminated with him coming to devour Earth before being stopped by the Fantastic Four with the help of the Silver Surfer. Well yeah, in this game that doesn't happen, at least not on screen. You defeat Doctor Doom, and then the game basically just ends. I am not joking. The Surfer flies away to stop Galactus, or at least that's what's implied, and Reed and Sue are like, yeah, so let's get married. And the game just ends anticlimactically. Man, I thought the Van Helsing game had an anticlimactic ending. That has nothing on this game's ending. It's like the developers ran out of time, and were just like, quick, end the game as soon as possible, add a final cutscene, that'll do them. So the game is basically the same as the first game, but with some major technical improvements. Unfortunately, they forgot to improve where it mattered the most, gameplay and level design, because the gameplay is pretty much the same, and the level design is considerably worse. Just like the first game, it has plenty of unlockable bonus features. You once again have Fantastic Four tokens that can be found hidden in the levels. These can unlock various features. You once again have plenty of concept art and character models to look at, as well as a whole bunch of comic covers. These are cool to look at. You also get a couple of trailers for the movie, as well as the ability to view the game's cutscenes from the menu. You also get several alternative costumes for the team, including some of the classics from the comics. Features like these are always appreciated by me. Unlike the first game, they weren't able to get the main cast of the movie to reprise their roles for the game. I'm not sure why that is, but in my personal opinion, the stand-ins did a good enough job, and the voice acting is fine.
Whatever it was, it may be the source of the cosmic surge.
You saw what it did to us, how it affected us.
Yes. Now we need to know how. And why.
So yeah, that pretty much sums up what the game has to offer. It's a decent looking game with a nice art style, and it's fun to play for a while. But it gets boring very quickly due to the repetitive level design, and lack of overall level and location variety. I give Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer a generous 4 out of 10. Another disappointment as far as I'm concerned. I'd say it's slightly better than the first game due to the fact it runs significantly better, but I'd say the first game had a bit more ambition and effort put into it. Either way, both games are massively disappointing, and I wouldn't recommend either. If you want to play a good Fantastic Four game, I would recommend playing Marvel Ultimate Alliance from 2006. That game is awesome, and you can play as every member of the Fantastic Four, and even the Silver Surfer. Just play that game for a better Fantastic Four experience. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed checking these games out. In spite of their flaws, they were at least very interesting to talk about. Before I end the video, I want to talk a little bit about the channel, since it gives me a good opportunity to ask for some feedback from viewers. So I mentioned back in December, at the end of my Batman Arkham Origins video that I made for Christmas, that I was a bit concerned that the channel wasn't really growing, despite the increase in production values, as well as the time and effort I put into these retrospectives. I mentioned how I was going to see how the channel did in the early part of the year, in terms of viewership, and decide based on the overall data, whether or not to continue making videos. Since the lack of views compared to what there used to be honestly makes it feel like a waste of time. I got some pretty positive feedback from that video, and several subscribers made it clear that they want me to continue producing content. Unfortunately though, the problem has consisted, and the videos, no matter what I upload, still aren't getting views. So I wanted to take the opportunity to ask anybody who's listening to this, is there any suggestions you guys have for ways that I could improve the videos? Anything I can do that will convince more people to watch? Because at this point in time, I'm honestly not sure what the solution is. As I mentioned in December, the response I get from people who do see the videos is generally positive. Yet despite this, the algorithm just seems to bury these videos after the first 24 hours. At this point, I just don't know what to do with the channel, and I'm starting to wonder if the majority of people on the internet just aren't interested in retro gaming content anymore. Should I just sell out and start reviewing modern games? Which is something I really don't want to do, believe me on that. Or should I just keep doing what I'm doing regardless of the lack of views? Or does anybody even care at this point? I don't know, you guys let me know, because I'm honestly out of ideas. For the time being, I'm going to continue to work on my current projects for the channel, and continue to analyse the data, so to speak. And we'll see what happens later in the year. Anyway, thanks for watching, stay tuned for more content, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more just like it. God bless.
And since Mom and Dad took the car, I'm wondering how you're getting home. Later, big guy.
You little son of a... Guess it's gonna be a long walk. I think I'll take...